Hello and welcome to Timeless with Julie Hartman Live. It is Tuesday, August 27th, 2024. I'm Julie Hartman, and it is great, as always, to be with you. 844-861-5537 is the call-in number, 844-861-5537. And as always, you can use the live chat. We are live right now on YouTube, as long as you keep it classy. As I said, we're live. We are live Mondays, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays on YouTube at 1 o'clock Pacific, 4 o'clock Eastern. But of course, you can watch or listen to the show after it is aired on YouTube or Apple or Spotify. You know, one of the reasons, or perhaps the main reason, that I called this show Timeless is because I believe that thousands of years of human civilization has produced some conclusions. And those are conclusions that all of us should pay attention to and apply to the changing circumstances of our lives now. Because, yes, in life, our circumstances do change. Certainly, as we've seen over the past 20 to 30 years, technology has changed rapidly. But even with all of that change, there's one thing that never changes, and that is human nature. And there is perhaps no realm that we see this more amply played out than the realm of politics. Literally, since the assassination of Julius Caesar over 2,000 years ago, we have seen that politics, time and time again, no matter where you live, what kind of system you are a part of, or who you are, is mired in betrayal, in maneuvering, in drama, in political calculations. And as we know, over the past 5 to 6 weeks, this 2024 presidential election cycle has been no different. And we are less than 75 days away from this upcoming match between former President Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris. One of my favorite episodes of the past few months pertaining to presidential election analysis was with Professor Luke Nichter, who I am so thrilled to welcome back onto the show today. You can see the photo that Sean and Rick just put up. I interviewed Mr. Nichter in August of 2023 about his spectacular book, which we're going to be discussing again today. It's called The Year That Broke Politics: Collusion and Chaos in the Presidential Election of 1968. Those of you who know anything about history will see, even from just a cursory understanding of the 68 presidential election, that the parallels between that election and this one that we are in now are utterly striking. There are many that we're going to dive into right now in our discussion, but just to name a few, we had, for instance, in 1968, an incumbent Democratic president step down in favor of his vice president. In 1968, this was President Lyndon Baines Johnson, who, of course, was a Democrat, and he, facing a lot of internal pressure from his party, the Democratic Party, was forced to step down in March of 1968, so a little earlier than President Biden, in favor of Vice President Hubert Humphrey. Just for a few moments, for old time's sake, let's watch this video, this short clip of his resignation in March of 1968. Actually, I shouldn't call it a resignation. I should call it a step down from the party, because he didn't resign from the presidency. He just resigned from being the Democratic nominee. Let's roll the tape.
With America's future under challenge right here at home, with our hopes and the world's hopes for peace and the balance every day, I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president. But let men everywhere know, however, that a strong and a confident and a vigilant America stands ready tonight to seek an honorable peace and stands ready tonight to defend an honored cause, whatever the price, whatever the burden, whatever the sacrifice that duty may require. Thank you for listening. Good night, and God bless all of you.
So we can see there that there are a lot of similarities between that resignation address and the one that President Biden issued just about 5 weeks ago. In addition to that similarity, we also know that in 1968, there was a pretty prominent outsider candidate. Let's pull up picture 3, which shows the 3 candidates in this race. I had mentioned the vice president, Hubert Humphrey of the Democratic Party. He replaced Lyndon Baines Johnson as the Democratic nominee. Then, of course, he was running against Republican Richard Nixon, who ended up winning the election. But they were facing off also against former Alabama, Governor George Wallace, who garnered a significant amount of votes in that 68 presidential election. Also, to just add on with the many similarities, and we haven't even gotten to the interview with Professor Nichter yet, but I'm just trying to really set the scene here. In 1968, the country was reeling from the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, who was running for president as a Democrat in 1968. And just 5 years before, in 1963, the country was shocked when the president of the United States, Democrat John F. Kennedy, was assassinated. And then 4 years later, this wasn't during 1968, but nevertheless, 4 years after, Alabama Governor George Wallace had tragically an assassination attempt on his life. We can see a picture of him there in picture 4. Thankfully, he did survive that attempt. And so, you know, doesn't take a lot of mental acuity to draw many of those parallels between 1968 and now. We know that President Biden, like Lyndon Baines Johnson, resigned. We know that there was an outsider candidate, at least up until about a week ago. RFK Jr. was running as an independent until he endorsed Donald Trump. And then, of course, very tragically, we have seen an assassination attempt in our own election cycle with the attempt on President Trump's life in July. And so, with that happy news, I'm very, very happy, truly, to welcome Professor Luke Nichter back to Timeless. He is a professor of history and the James H. Kavanaugh Endowed Chair in Presidential Studies at Chapman University. He specializes in not just the modern presidency, but the Cold War and just generally United States political and diplomatic history. And here's what's so cool about Mr. Nichter's work, among other things. He has filed over 2,000 Freedom of Information Act requests for the purpose of opening historically important records to public access. And one such case, spearheaded by Professor Nichter, resulted in the US government actually declassifying Watergate records from 1972. And you can go onto his website, nixontapes.org, which has the largest declassified volume of President Nixon's tapes known to man. In addition to all of that, Professor Nichter is a New York Times best-selling author of several books about LBJ, Nixon, the Nixon tapes, and the one we're discussing now is, of course, The Year That Broke Politics, Collusion and Chaos in the Presidential Election of 1968. Professor Nichter, welcome back to the show. It's great to see you.
Well, thank you. It's great to be back on. I feel like this might be coming back on the show. It's sort of act 2 of a Greek tragedy where we haven't really resolved anything, but the plot's become quite a bit more complex.
Yes, that is certainly true. I remember being in studio with you in October of last year, and we were both kind of surmising that President Biden was going to drop out. By the way, I don't think that it took a Nostradamus level of prophecy to intuit that that was going to happen. But it is just so unbelievable to see now in August, less than 75 days away, how much really has unfolded. And you told me off the air that you've been very busy in this election cycle. I can imagine so with all of the parallels.
Well, and there's nothing, I don't think there's really a meaningful prize for writing a guide to a dystopian year like the one we have here. But I do think you're seeing more reporting like yours, engaging with history. It seems more Americans are aware that we have a history and are discussing it. And so maybe something will be achieved.
Yes. Well, you just heard I gave a very cursory overview of some of the surface level similarities between 1968 and 2024. What would you say is the biggest through line? If you were to tell Americans one thing that they have to know about the 68 election and how it relates to today, what would be that thing that you would tell them?
I think the biggest thing I would say is that we've reached a point similar to '68, as in today, when a critical mass of Americans have lost faith in American institutions. Whether that be sort of all levels of the government, the national media, higher education leaders. They simply not only don't trust people in positions of authority, but actually think they might be harming them. And I think when the political class didn't have the answers in 1968, as they seem to be scrambling again, we've heard so much about the donor class, and other phrases have entered our lexicon since October 7th, after our last discussion. I think we're in at a point when we see populist movements. The reason why they're thriving is because the voters are out of sync with the donor class and the political class.
Well, certainly, it is true that right now we have great distrust of our institutions. And one thing that I remember reading in your book, back when I read it the last time that we had a discussion, I can remember parts of it now, is that President Johnson had a lot of internal pressure from his party to resign. And of course, when things like that happen in politics, it's obviously done clandestinely. No party is going to shout out to the American people, hey, we're trying to push the candidate out. But perhaps I'm wrong about this. It seemed in 1968 that the American people were sort of more aware, at least, of what was going on behind the scenes. Whereas, in my judgment, of course, cut in if you disagree with me, for months and months and months, not only in this election cycle, not only was President Biden saying, I'm staying in the race, I'm staying in the race. It's only if the Lord Almighty, tells me to drop out of the race that I would drop out of the race. But also, the behind the scenes concerns about President Biden's mental acuity and age were kept very hush hush, and the American people were gaslit about it. I remember in February, Senator Chuck Schumer said that it was right wing propaganda that Joe Biden was suffering from some mental difficulties. So, do you think that this distrust of the government is worse now than it was in 1968, or is it pretty equal?
That's hard to say. We're quite a bit different as a country, also, and I think also, I would add to that. Oftentimes what a politician thinks and what they do, what we see them do, what they see them say, might not be what they think, or what they do behind the scenes. I think it's one of the major lessons of this book, that a withdrawal from politics or from the ballot, in the case of Johnson in '68 and Biden this year, is not a withdrawal from politics. And Johnson in '68 continued to maneuver behind the scenes, because every mention of Humphrey as a successor was a reminder that the elite and the really the more left wing of his party pressured him to get out. And so I would imagine these days LBJ is feeling that Biden is feeling about Harris much the same way that LBJ did about Humphrey back in 1968.
Hmm. Can you please set the scene for us about the main issues in the 1968 election? We know, of course, the Vietnam War was one of those biggest issues. In fact, I was reading earlier today that in that speech that we just heard, where President Johnson announced that he wouldn't be seeking reelection, he actually had spent 40 minutes before in that speech talking about the Vietnam War. So, can you just outline for us what was going on in Vietnam and sort of more of the domestic and other international issues that were at the forefront of our nation's concern?
Yeah, absolutely. And, the last time we had a conversation, out of all the similarities, that you summed up nicely in the intro between 1968 and 2024, I would have said two of the biggest differences are really this year the lack of political violence and the fact that President Biden didn't appear to be inclined to do an LBJ and withdraw from the race. And as you say, in the last 6 weeks or so, those have both been erased. But in addition to, I would say, the political dynamics and the feeling of much of the electorate with regard to their loss of faith in institutions, a number of the issues are similar in terms of an unpopular war. Now, Vietnam was a little bit different because I think, unlike Israel and Gaza, the military draft, conscription in service was something that united both parties and united people across social and economic class. I think now we're talking about a narrower subset of the electorate that's concerned about Israel and Gaza. Of course, the issue is no less important for them. But here, it's really not just an unpopular war, it's more than one. What do we do about Russia and Ukraine? What does the next president have to say about that? Always concern about China in the backdrop with regard to Taiwan. But also in 68 and 2024, I would add to the list of an unpopular war concern about the economy. Inflation was a real concern in the late 1960s as a result of expensive domestic programs that drove inflation up for Americans by the end of the decade. And so I think, as we said, the political dynamics, the issues, and also the concern among many of the electorate. There are very few issues that you naturally unite Republicans and Democrats. And in 68, I think one of those was there's a lot of people still around the center who just want to turn the noise level down. And this year, it's still not really clear what that silent majority, if we can call them that, thinks about that. But I think there are a lot of Americans this year, too, who want to return to something that appears to be a bit calmer and more normal.
Did Americans in 1968, generally speaking, the members of that silent majority, as you say, did they more so see Hubert Humphrey or Richard Nixon as the candidate that would bring that kind of normalcy and peace?
Well, I think ultimately they voted for Nixon for that reason because it's a little bit like Palestinian protesters protesting in Chicago. Some people say, well, why would you protest the party that's more inclined to be with you on the issue? And similar in the 60s with the Vietnam War protesters, Hubert Humphrey got it far worse during much of the campaign. The Democrats in Chicago got it much worse, even though the party was more in line with the peace activists. But the thing is, they were the party in power during the 1960s. They were in power in the presidency all but the first month of 1961, and all of the whole decade in the House and the Senate also. And so you protest the people who are in power, who have a chance to make a difference in terms of policy. And so I think I think another similarity now you have this year is the protests are focused very much on those with control of the levers of power.
Yes, I'm very curious if you think that there is hope in this 2024 election that we can get to some kind of normalcy, because the thing about history is there's a lot to learn from, of course, the bad things that happened. But if things were this tumultuous in 1968 and we got through it, maybe we should feel better about our prospects in 2024. As someone who maybe tends to err on the side of pessimism or worry, seeing again just how tumultuous things were back then gives me some hope for the future that we can overcome this moment. But before we discuss that, I want to tell people about something that can help them overcome a particularly economically volatile moment that we're in right now, and that is investing in gold. Economists are warning us about massive tax hikes that could hit our IRAs and 401ks hard. With inflation rising and global uncertainty, it's no wonder central banks and many Americans are turning to gold. If you haven't thought about gold yet, now is the time, and you should consider trusting Priority Gold to help you diversify your savings with gold and silver. Text Golden to 1 800 405 Gold for a free gold information guide and see if you qualify for free shipping and storage. Experts agree that physical gold is one of the best ways to fortify your savings right now by tying your assets to something physical. Act now to get your portfolio working for you while, at least for now, the market is golden. Text Golden to 1 800 405 Gold to learn more. That's text 1 800 Golden, to 1 800 405 Gold. By the way, speaking of gold, Professor Nichter, it was President Richard Nixon who took the country off of the gold standard, I believe, in shortly after coming into office. So I'd be curious to know your thoughts on that. A lot of people think that that was a big mistake.
Well, yeah, he made that, the base, and we could go have a whole conversation about the gold standard and put listeners to sleep with financial history and monetary history. But, the short version was Nixon was really left holding the bag after more than a decade of financial irresponsibility by those before him. We were supposed to maintain a fixed link between gold at Fort Knox and numbers of dollars in circulation. And we had more, by summer of 71, we had more than 30 billion in US dollars circulating and less than 10 million in gold backing them. And so,
Mm.
he was in the unfortunate position where he had to make a drastic action and not patch the system up. So it was, this is your Trivial Pursuit knowledge of the day. It was August 15th of 1971 when Nixon preempted the popular television show Bonanza on a Sunday night and to destroy the hopes of those viewers by announcing on TV that he was ending the gold standard. So that's how that happened.
What a way to do it. Wow.
Well,
Uh,
and I think a lot of economic historians say that was really the birth of globalization for all of its benefits and
mm,
drawbacks, because it really allowed, in a sense, sort of almost unlimited gains, but also very deep drops. And so I think our economic cycles in both directions have become more extreme since then.
wow. On another episode, Professor Nichter, I would love to talk to you about this financial history, and also when you speak about globalization. I was just in 7 countries for 5 weeks in Europe, and it was so interesting to see how everyone everywhere speaks English. Everyone everywhere wants the dollar. Obviously, the dollar is the global reserve currency. So the listeners can speak for themselves on whether or not the financial talk is boring, but I would welcome another episode with you discussing that because it really is so important. And speaking of another parallel, obviously, decades of financial irresponsibility is particularly pertinent in this 2024 election. Speaking of someone who I think has really done a fantastic job of making our fiscal recklessness a main issue of his campaign is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who we know just about a week ago suspended his campaign and endorsed President Donald Trump. I'm curious to know the parallels that you may see between the former Alabama governor George Wallace, who was the independent candidate in the 1968 election, and RFK Jr.
Yeah, no, it's a rich question, and this is an area where like the rest of the 2 years, there are both similarities but also differences. You set it up there during the introduction. We don't see this very often as Americans. Maybe about once a generation. I mean, we always have third party candidates, and when I vote, you see usually the two big parties at the top of the ballot, and then down I at least allow my eyes to continue down the ballot, and a lot of times I see names and parties, and in some cases I've never heard of, I'm ashamed to say. Obviously that's not the case of Robert Kennedy, who has huge name ID and a famous last name. But the last time we saw this is probably, Ross Perot, maybe 1992, who polled as high as 39% at one point, but did not win any electoral college votes. You have to go back to 1968. Wallace won 10 million votes at a time when the nation's population was much smaller, only about 200 million. But he won 46 electoral votes in 5 states in the South. And I think, that wasn't enough to capture the White House. It was enough to make a difference in some of those states where the margin between Humphrey and Nixon was smaller than what George Wallace won. I think the real similarity is two. I take away two things from Wallace's campaign and look at this year. I think number one, more than the number of votes won, he was able to influence the issues going forward and influence the conversation we were going to have. We have about policy going forward. And for Wallace, and at some degree it's Kennedy, it's the people who felt left behind in the political system. Beginning
Mm.
with Wallace, moving forward, I would say really put a spotlight on the kind of blue collar, working class, lower middle class, whatever term you want to use. And both political parties have been competing for their votes ever since. These votes of traditional New Deal Democrats. And so I don't know that Robert Kennedy's endorsement of Trump will cause a lot of votes to change. But I think he and Tulsi Gabbard, if they're co-chairing this transition team, do have an outsized role in influencing the issues going forward.
It's interesting that you say that George Wallace was kind of representing people who felt left behind in American politics, because I think that was the hole that RFK Jr. filled. And that is a referendum on both the Democratic and the Republican Party. You know, obviously RFK Jr. spoke a lot about the censorship within the Democratic Party because of course he first ran as a Democrat before switching to become an independent. But it's just interesting to look at these two elections, two very volatile moments in American history, with, as you had mentioned, specifically economic problems on the forefront and in an unpopular war that is both in 1968 and 2024. So it's sort of interesting that we see in these two election cycles that it tends to be these kind of moments that draw in the outsider candidates to represent those who feel left behind from both parties.
It is, yeah. I would describe them as those who feel left behind, but also the kind of doubters, the people who think that people in authority have misled us or in some case harmed us. It's also interesting too because I feel like, at least in my news feeds, the Trump campaign is often viewed as ideologically very narrow and closed-minded, a very small tent approach. But now you've got Robert Kennedy Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard, which to me suggests quite an unusual broad approach, for a candidate, especially one who's been labeled as being so narrow-minded. It's really an interesting shift in the race.
You know, I'm curious before the interview, and by the way, for our listeners, Professor Nichter did something before the interview that I loved. I so admire it. He said, I'm going to save our discussion for on the air. And just a little behind the scenes peek. I always do that with guests. I even do that with Sean, my producer, who we bring on the air. I say, we're not going to talk until we're on the air. But you did mention something that really, really intrigued me, and I didn't know. And it's that George Wallace, when he ran for president in 1968, he ran from the American Independent Party. I think you said that was the name. But you also said that for most of his political career, he was a Democrat, and then later in his life, he was voting as a Republican. And I can't help but see a striking similarity between George Wallace and RFK Jr., who not only for most of his life was a Democrat, but comes from the most quintessential Democrat family dynasty, perhaps in American history. And now he is joining forces with a Republican. What do you make of that?
Yeah, at one point in the book, I think I actually call Wallace a Republican. I mean, I'm not aware that he ever changed parties, and a couple of readers wrote in and said, no, he was always a lifelong Democrat. Well, I think by the end of his life, Wallace did behave more like a Republican. The similarity that I see in this regard between 68 and 2024 is you have, those moderate Democrats who are left who differentiate themselves versus the national Democratic Party. And
Mm.
that was something that Wallace did in the late 1968, and a lot of Southern Democrats, they remained, in their view, loyal Democrats. In Wallace's case, an Alabama Democrat, but he's tried to put difference between himself and national Democratic leaders. And now you look at, one thing I think a lot of the media aren't talking about is what about those moderate Democrats who are in Trump congressional districts or in Trump states who chose not to go to the convention in Chicago? Whether that be Sherrod Brown, John Fetterman, I'm thinking like, Adam Frisch of Colorado 3, who kind of redistricted Lauren Boebert ultimately. I talked to him earlier this year, and He said, you know, I drive a red Ford F-150, 48,000 miles around my district. I don't talk about climate change when I talk to ranchers. I talk about land. I talk about water concerns, for their livestock. And you see a divide growing between kind of local issues for those moderate Democrats and the issues of the National Democratic Party. And you had that in 1968 too. Even our political language is shifting in response to the altered political landscape.
Wow. Yes, something that I always get a bit confused about because it's not taught, shall we say, in the best way, was in 1968 the Democratic Party and Republican Party's general positions on the Vietnam War. Because, we tend to look back and think that Democrats, because really of President John F. Kennedy, were mostly against the war, and of course also because of the anti-Vietnam War protests, which were generally speaking uh, with participants from the Democratic Party. But also, there were many Republicans, it seems, that were against the Vietnam War. And when Richard Nixon ran for president, again, you will be the person to correct me if I'm wrong, as the expert yourself, he was running to end it quickly. Now, of course, that didn't happen. The war dragged on until 1972. And there were I think between 1968 and 1972, there were the same amount of American service member deaths in the Vietnam War as there were between 1965 and 1968. So clearly, Richard Nixon did not deliver on his promise. But can you set the record straight for us? What in 68, what were LBJ, or then Hubert Humphrey, and Richard Nixon promising with regard to the Vietnam War? And did that reflect their party's general positions on that matter?
Yeah, it's a great question, and believe it or not, I still consider some of this to be sort of cutting edge history. You don't think
I
of
bet.
something this old to be cutting edge. And I'm just going off of memory here. Anyone with access to Wikipedia can find these figures more quickly than I can speak them. But out of 58,000 roughly American war dead, not including injured, and not including South Vietnamese or North Vietnamese tallies, which are even higher, or American allies like the South Koreans or the Australians and others. I think somewhere around 38, 39,000 were under LBJ, or 29, 28, a little more than half were under LBJ, and a little less than half were under Nixon. But you're right. I think Nixon optimistically hoped that as president, he could end the war very quickly. I don't think he ever attached a timetable. I think some of Hubert Humphrey, not Humphrey himself, but some of Humphrey's staffers in '68 suggested maybe within 6 months that he as president would withdraw 500,000 American troops in Southeast Asia. And I think as presidents often do, you realize how much more complicated the situation is. You inherit treaty commitments. Our allies are also fighting. It's not just Americans. There are peace talks going on in Paris, as today we have with Israel and Gaza in Cairo and in other cities. And there's a process that you inherit as president that you're not fully aware of until you become president. And so Nixon, often the history books, it gets reduced to a slogan, and Nixon, it's reduced to that he had a secret plan to end the Vietnam War. That's sometimes that's even put in quotes as something that he said. And as far as I can tell, he never actually said that. That occurred at a press conference in New Hampshire that he did when he was asked by the Associated Press, and he did a very clever thing where he was very light on specifics, and he sort of tapped his sort of jacket pocket as if to say, I've got a piece of paper in there, and that's my plan. And that evolved into Nixon's secret plan. It was the first year in the Vietnam era where both of the major party nominees campaigned to get out of the war, to disengage, that American commitment would no longer increase indefinitely, but would begin to wind down in some way. Humphrey was promising, I think, a shorter timetable. Nixon had fewer specifics attached to his. And in hindsight, I say cutting edge because if I'm right in the book about the General Non-Aggression Pact that LBJ and Nixon had, their longtime nemesis in politics, then I think what Nixon was trying to do during much of the campaign on Vietnam, as well as other issues, was to say as little as possible, because he didn't want to have any difference between him and LBJ, because he realized that behind the scenes, LBJ could be a very powerful influence. Not that someone would come out and endorse Nixon, but that he could withhold support from Humphrey. And it was clear that Johnson was not very close to his own vice president personally. So I think Nixon was very light on specifics. And as I say, cutting edge going forward, 5.5 years of Nixon's presidency, whether Vietnam or for a Republican, is very forward looking domestic policy, the EPA, clean air, clean water, and OSHA. We could go on and on. The list of achievements is almost as great as the Great Society. The size of government under Nixon didn't shrink; it actually grew over LBJ's Great Society. So I say cutting edge because I think this non-aggression pact, as long as Johnson lived on a ranch in Texas while Nixon was president, I think Nixon wanted to govern in a way that mostly conformed with how LBJ would have handled the issues, Vietnam as well as others.
By the way, that's one of my dinner party fun facts that President Richard Nixon, a Republican, founded the Environmental Protection Agency. That and that Republican President Dwight Eisenhower sent in the National Guard to desegregate. I believe it was in Little Rock, Arkansas,
Little
the public school there after the court order. But people find that to be shocking that Richard Nixon actually established the EPA. Speaking of which, to bring it in our final minutes, to the 2024 election today, how do you see the do you let me rephrase. Do you see the Republican Party policies of 2024 more or less reflecting the Republican Party policies of 1968? I think it's fair to say that the same cannot be said of the Democratic Party. I think the Democratic Party is completely different today in most respects than it was in 1968, and I believe it's completely different in most respects than it was in 2008 and even in 2016. Uh, as I've said many times in this discussion, cut in, of course, if you disagree with that. But I'm more interested in the Republican Party. What do you think? Has the Republican Party changed, or is it a true conservative party in the sense that there's a continuity in many of the policy positions?
Yeah, I think, and you're obviously very steeped in history, and you talk a lot about history on your show. So your viewers and listeners have always benefited from that. I would say politics is not static. Things are constantly in flux, and what it means to be a conservative is always changing. What it means to be a liberal is always changing. We
True.
have other terms like progressive. So I would say that they're probably not the same. History is, as I say, I can barely make sense of the past. And that's what I do for a living. I certainly can't make sense of the present. History doesn't repeat itself. It certainly doesn't predict the future, but there are things between now and November that I look for. I look to watch. 68 is not a perfect guide. I think it probably is the best guide that we have. And I think some of the things that I'm looking for is the Republican Party. I think has always been pretty broad ideologically. Now, some of that depends on who the nominee is and the direction of policy at a particular moment. To your point about Republicans in the EPA or desegregating and sending in the National Guard of Little Rock High School in 1957, the Republican Party used to be the more liberal party. And probably after the experience of the 1960s, when many conservative Democrats were leaving the Democratic Party by the millions and moving in the Republican Party, there's been another shift. And I think, again, this book came out 55 years after the 68 election. And I think I'm obviously proud of it, but I think it's a fair look at what actually happened. It's not a partisan account written by a firsthand observation. And I think we lack perspective now. I think we're again in the eye of some kind of a storm. We're in the midst of a huge political shift. One more comparison, not just 68 to 2024, but to look at the decades as a longer momentum. In the 60s, you have three presidents, all three, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, all three of their presidencies ended prematurely for different reasons, but before they planned to call it quits. And now we have, again, Trump, Biden. We don't know what's next. But I think to me, this is an indicator that we're again in the midst of some big political shift. And it's going to take considerable time and perspective to look back and figure out what was really going on. And that perspective is probably not going to be written by you or me, by people who lived through it. It's going to be lived by a later generation who can look at it more dispassionately and isn't connected to the events themselves.
It's an excellent point you make about the shifting terms. I mean, I find today that so many people use, they say I'm conservative or I'm liberal, and then you find out their policy positions, and you may not think that they're conservative or liberal, but I think you're right that we're in this huge moment of political shifting, especially with regard to these terms. Like many people, for instance, who I've talked to who are voting for Donald Trump say, I'm not conservative. I just am voting for common sense. And then I know many people who are voting for Kamala Harris and they're saying, I'm not super left, I'm liberal. It just, we live in a how you identify culture with
Yeah, and I
regard
think
to
that's also indicative of one of those institutions that people have lost faith in is sort of organized political parties.
yeah.
Seem to be a kind of a nadir because one of the most, people, we often talk about the political continuum or spectrum as it being two dimensional. And I think it really is three dimensional. There's this populist part where it kind of wraps around and connects. And in that place, it's fascinating. You get sort of Bernie Sanders populism and Donald Trump populism kind of shakes hands in terms of concern about free trade and jobs and China and social media, sometimes with different political motivations. But I think there is a backside of the continuum where it wraps around and touches. And that brings new people into politics, which I think is usually a good thing.
You say that 1968 is a roadmap. I want to close by asking you, and by the way, my co-host and boss Dennis Prager says that in his 40 years of talk show hosting, he's never gotten into the realm of predictions. So I completely respect if you share his point of view on that. But given what happened in 1968 and given so many of the striking similarities, what do you think will happen in 2024? And if you're not willing or not able to answer, of course, none of us are able to answer what will happen, or if you're unable to predict what will happen this election, what lessons can we glean? And I know that's a very general question from 1968. Should we try to cool down the temperature of our political discourse? Are there certain candidates or policies we should pay attention to? Again, just generally speaking, how can we use this election as a roadmap for this upcoming one in November?
Well, I think first I should offer the disclaimer that I've probably been as wrong as any other political pundit when it comes to making predictions. So rather than tell you what I think, I'll tell you what history suggests.
Okay.
So it's things that I'm looking for. Hubert Humphrey in 1968 had an impossible task running as an incumbent as the vice president under an outgoing unpopular president. And so this is the challenge to set this up and things I'm looking for the Harris campaign. The reason she has multiple challenges, and perhaps the most important is she has to run simultaneously on continuity and change. So everything they've
Wow.
done for 4 years has to be great, and we're going to do more of that. But anytime you have a new idea, a Senate can say, if it's so great, why didn't you do it already? The difficulty is she needs to keep her base excited without betraying her political patron. And the media honeymoon can continue only so long, where she needs to actually shift to policy to excite her base. And that's where you're going to see differences between her and Biden. I think that the best Republican strategy you can do is to get her to talk about issues that expose differences between her and Biden, because that gives you a wedge on the Democratic side of the aisle. In terms of history, I'll give you two data points. One, sometimes, I would say only twice in the modern era have the Democrats nominated someone from the liberal wing of the party who ran as a liberal. And that's two different things. I would argue that in 2008, Obama still mostly ran as a centrist who wanted to have broader appeal. And in 72, George McGovern lost in a 49 state landslide, losing even his home state of South Dakota. And in 1984, former Vice President Walter Mondale also lost in a 49 state landslide, winning only his home state of Minnesota. The second data point I would give you is no vice president in the modern era has won sitting vice president with the party still in power in the White House, with the exception of George H.W. Bush in 1988. Nixon lost in 60, Humphrey lost in 68, Gore lost in 2000. Hillary Clinton, I realize, was not vice president, but as Secretary of State was very closely tied to Obama policy in 2016, having been a prominent member of his administration. And the difficulty is you have to run on continuity and change. And it's very difficult to do that simultaneously. I would argue Bush in 88 ran more on continuity because Reagan was so popular than suggesting that he's going to fundamentally change anything. So I think the historical odds are very much uphill for her, no matter what the national media say. Now, the one qualifier I'll add is, of course, she's running against Donald Trump, not against Ronald Reagan in 84 or Richard Nixon in 72, two very popular incumbent presidents. And obviously, former President Trump is a very different politician who's much more divisive, although no less skilled, I would argue, politically than the others. But I think that's what I would say history suggests to watch for.
We will see. We will meet again, Professor Nichter, on the show and see how it all unfolds.
Well, if
Thank
we
you
do
so
come back for a third act of our Greek tragedy, by then, of course, as the Greeks would say, we will have resolved it all.
That's right. Hopefully, we will have resolved it in the best possible way. But I look forward to part 3 in any case. And thank you so much for your time. And by the way, I hope you have a fantastic start to the school year over at Chapman. I'm sure it's a very exciting time to be.
Well, we had an encampment in the spring. We've now banned encampments as the UC system has. Students are coming back. This issue is not going to go away, and of course, the October 7th anniversary is coming up. So I hope it's a good year, and I hope it's not too exciting of a year.
That's right. Mellow is what we all strive for on our campuses and our country. We can agree on that. Thank you so much again, and I look forward to speaking with you soon. And to close, I want to talk to you again about gold because right now is a really good time to tie your assets to something physical. As I was talking about earlier, economists are warning us about massive tax hikes that could hit our IRAs and 401ks hard. With inflation rising and global uncertainty, it's no wonder central banks and many Americans are turning to gold. If you haven't thought about gold yet, now is the time. It's a really good time to help you diversify your savings. And you should consider trusting Priority Gold to buy gold and silver. Text GOLDEN to 1-800-405-GOLD for a free gold information guide and see if you qualify for free shipping and storage. Experts agree that physical gold is one of the best ways to fortify your savings. Act now to get your portfolio working for you. Well, at least for now, the market is golden. Text GOLDEN to 1-800-405-GOLD. That's text GOLDEN to 1-800-405-GOLD. And I also want to talk with you quickly about My Pillow products. As I have told you, I sleep on a My Pillow. I sleep on the Giza Dream bed sheets. I wear my slippers, and I use kitchen towels and their bath towel sets. And you can get many of these products for a great discount if you use the promo code Hartman. Right now, for instance, you can get the queen size premium My Pillow for only $19.98. That's made with a patented adjustable fill that adjusts to your exact individual needs, regardless of your sleep position. It helps keep your neck aligned and it holds its shape all night long so that you can get the sleep that you need. But that's not all. You can also get their 6-piece kitchen or bath towel sets for only $25. Their brand new mattress topper for as low as $69.98, and their famous My Pillow bed sheets for as low as $25. Go to mypillow.com or call 1-800-566-6745 and use the promo code Hartman to get big discounts on all My Pillow products, including, as I said, the premium queen size My Pillow for only $19.98. That's the lowest price ever. Hartman is the promo code at checkout. Thanks, everyone. I'll see you tomorrow at 1 o'clock Pacific, 4 o'clock Eastern for another live show. And be sure to check out our Dennis and Julie from this past Sunday. It was a really good episode. Be well, everyone. I'll see you soon.